Everyone evacuated the hospital, but she stayed, and what happened next was incredible. A regular nurse in a community hospital in Louisiana faces one of the biggest hurricanes in history without abandoning her patients. While everyone evacuates, she stays and turns fear into courage. This is the inspiring story of Emily Carter, a true account of resilience, leadership and humanity in the midst of disaster. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The sticky Louisiana heat already hinted at a heavy day ahead as Emily Carter crossed the parking lot of the small community hospital where she'd worked for 8 years. It was still early morning, but the wail of emergency sirens echoed through the city, a constant reminder that nothing about this day would be normal. In the lobby, hastily posted notices announced the closure of schools, community centers, and public offices. At the reception desk, patients waited for news about transportation, while volunteers handed out thin blankets to those being sent to temporary shelters. Emily, her ID badge swinging at her neck and her hair pulled tightly into a bun, felt a mix of tension and professional focus. There was no room for panic. The radios crackled with continuous bulletins about the Category 4 hurricane charging through the Gulf of Mexico, and the order for a full evacuation had arrived only hours earlier. The hospital had been instructed to transfer all critical patients to larger facilities in neighboring cities, but a shortage of ambulances and the sudden surge in demand left some names off the immediate transport list. As she moved through the corridors, Emily mentally updated each case: 2 elderly patients with no family in town, a young mother with a newborn waiting to be discharged, a post-operative patient still recovering, and a teenage girl with an open fracture awaiting stabilization for travel. Medical and nursing teams worked at high speed to prepare everyone, filling out forms and hooking IV bags to portable stands. Doctors explained procedures, volunteers hauled stretchers and boxes of medication, and the metallic clatter of wheels on the polished floor underscored the urgency. In the cafeteria, boxes of ready meals were stacked for those leaving by helicopter, while administrators handed out ID vests to streamline boarding. The scene wasn't chaotic, but a race against time with limited resources. Watching every detail, Emily felt a growing worry for those still without a destination. She knew the shelters were full and the roads were already clogging. With cars and buses evacuating the city, by 10 o'clock, a new bulletin announced that wind speeds had increased and air routes would soon be shut down. Military helicopters hovered above the hospital, airlifting critical patients directly from the rooftop helipad. Emily climbed the emergency stairs to watch one of the loadings and saw a transformed landscape. Long lines of cars stuck on the avenues, storefronts boarded up, and a charcoal gray sky streaked with thick clouds. The wind was already lifting light debris and rattling the upper floor windows. The transport crew told her they had only minutes left to complete the operation and that staff should prepare to evacuate as well. She went back downstairs, passing co-workers collecting essential equipment and closing entire wards. The militarized efficiency contrasted sharply with the fearful faces of some patients who weren't sure they'd be taken. Back on the main floor, Emily found one of the volunteers trying to soothe the young mother with the baby, who was crying at the sound of sirens and rotor blades. The woman had no family in the region and no car to get out. One of the elderly patients sat in a wheelchair at the end of the hall, waiting without complaint, but with a resigned expression. Emily knelt beside him and explained that transport was being arranged, though she knew the last ambulance had left minutes ago. At that moment, a message crackled over the internal radio. Outside, teams would not make it back in time to collect the remaining patients. The order was clear. All staff were to abandon the building and head to designated shelters. She looked at the hallway full of people with nowhere to go and felt the weight of an imminent choice. There was no heroics in her gesture, just a sense of duty that bound her to those who needed her. The head nurse preparing to leave, repeated the order, and handed Emily a reflective vest for identification if she went with the next transport. Emily thanked her but tucked the vest into her pocket without putting it on. She began walking from room to room, checking vital signs and adjusting IV bags, speaking in a calm tone to keep patients' anxiety down. She asked the security guard on duty to leave internal doors unlocked to allow movement if the wind knocked down any walls. At the nurse's station, she picked up an extra radio, flashlights, and a first aid kit to keep at hand. Each move was deliberate preparation for a long night ahead, meant to maintain control even as chaos gathered outside. Out in the parking lot, evacuation buses were pulling away, packed with staff and volunteers. Emily saw colleagues she'd worked alongside for years climbing aboard, some crying, others taking quick phone videos of the building. A driver offered her a seat, but she shook her head and explained she would stay until someone came for those left behind. He warned her the roads could become impassable in minutes. She thanked him but stood firm. She went back inside, drew a deep breath, and closed the door behind her. In the corridor, the elderly man still waited. The young mother rocked her baby, and the injured teen tried to doze despite the noise. Emily knew she couldn't promise immediate rescue, but she could offer care, safety, and a reliable presence. That would have to be enough until help came. The distant wind was growing louder, and she gripped the radio in her hands, fully aware that this decision would shape the hours to come. Formally ending her shift and accepting that she would stay, Emily stopped by the supply room to gather extra blankets, gloves, and masks. She spotted stacks of bottled water originally meant for evacuation teams and decided to distribute them to the patients to keep everyone hydrated during the uncertain wait. She prepared a more central room to gather them all, away from windows and possible falling debris. Each step was measured. Beds pushed against interior walls, portable equipment within arm's reach, radios charging off the generator. Her aim was to reduce risks before the wind reached full strength. Even tired, she kept her voice professional, explaining to each patient what was happening without alarm. The storm had not yet hit at its peak, but the hospital had already become a refuge for those who could not leave. And Emily, fully aware of what she was taking on, braced herself for whatever came next. The wind started as a distant whistle, but within minutes became a steady roar that rattled the windows of the community hospital. Stationed at the central desk, Emily Carter felt the first real impact of the hurricane when one of the automatic doors in the main lobby slammed so hard the alarm went off. Heavy, slanted rain seeped through the gaps of older window frames, pooling on the polished floor. A pane of glass in a side corridor shattered with a sharp crack, and she quickly swept up the fragments to prevent injuries. The fluorescent lights flickered twice before going out, leaving darkness broken only by the beeping of heart monitors and the sound of the wind. The generator took over part of the load, but powered only vital equipment, plunging the rest of the building into a tense half-light. The air took on a metallic smell, mixed with the disinfectant from the wards, and Emily realized the storm had finally reached the heart of the city. Even so, she kept her tone steady so as not to alarm the patients, who were already whispering questions about what was happening. With no time to waste, she gathered the patients still scattered in the outer rooms. Speaking clearly, she explained that she would move them to a safer area in the center of the building, away from windows exposed to the wind. With the help of the security guard who had chosen to stay and a volunteer, she transferred the young mother and her baby to an interior room once used to store sterile supplies, now turned into a refuge. The elderly dialysis patient, unable to walk on his own, was placed in a reinforced wheelchair and moved to the same space. Emily used rechargeable flashlights to light the way, setting one in each corner of the corridor so everyone could see where they were going. The sound of the wind grew into a continuous roar, and each step had to be deliberate to avoid accidents. She spread sheets over the stretchers to shield patients from water dripping in from the doors. The hospital wasn't a scene of chaos, but a race against time with limited resources. Every move she made was methodical, the product of years on shift, repeated with care to keep fear from taking hold. Once she had settled the most vulnerable, she realized their communication radios were starting to fail. The signal that had reached the city center was gone, replaced by static. She tried calling from the nurse's station's landline, but the connection died before she could finish dialing. Her cell phone had shown no signal for over half an hour, making it impossible to update the administration on their situation. She understood that at least for now, they were on their own. Without panic, she began giving instructions, handing out bottles of mineral water she'd found in the supply room, distributing blankets to those shivering from drafts, and checking each patient's pulse and temperature. The children cried and were comforted by the volunteer as Emily inventoried the most urgent medications. The sound of the wind blended with slamming doors, but her voice stayed steady and measured, explaining each step so everyone would feel some sense of control. Hearing a loud crash nearby, she decided to reinforce the interior doors. She rolled wheeled cabinets and screens into place to block entrances leading to outer corridors, creating barriers to stop objects carried by the wind from entering the inner rooms. She arranged stretchers neatly in the internal hallway, leaving space for circulation and easy access to patients. She wrote out identification by hand on each patient's arm in case rapid transport became necessary. She herself reviewed the first aid kits, separating the immediate use medications and storing them in an easily accessible spot. She positioned flashlights strategically to ensure minimal lighting if the generator failed. Despite the chaos outside, the space began to feel organized and cared for, giving everyone a sense of calm. Even tired, she kept her tone professional, explaining to each patient what was happening without alarm so no one would feel abandoned. Emily glanced at the dead radio and remembered the order she'd received hours earlier. All staff must evacuate. She knew that at that moment she could still try to leave and reach a shelter before the streets were flooded. But as she looked around at the baby sleeping in his mother's arms, the elderly man's weary face, and the teenage girl with her arm immobilized, she felt she couldn't abandon them. There was no time for staged heroics. It was simply her professional and human conscience speaking louder. She drew a deep breath, tucked the flashlight into her lab coat pocket, and continued checking every detail as if she were on a routine shift, even though the sound of wind and rain was becoming deafening. The storm battered the walls, the doors vibrated, but her posture was that of someone who knew what needed to be done. As she closed the last interior door, Emily felt the full weight of her dilemma. On one side, her own safety and obedience to the official order. On the other, responsibility for lives depending on her. She chose to stay, without promising rescues or miracles, simply ensuring that every minute was used to protect those under her care. Sitting for a moment on the bench beside the patients, listening to the hurricane roar through the building, she understood the night would be long, but that her decision was already made. She would stay, not out of boldness, but because she knew this was where she belonged until the storm passed. The building shook with gusts, but she kept her eyes fixed on the clock, marking each minute like a beat of hope. The responsibility she carried gave purpose to every movement. The clock had just passed 2 in the morning when the generator, which had been powering vital equipment and the few remaining lights, gave a sharp crack and went dead. The hospital was plunged into total darkness, a blackness that seemed to swallow every sound. For a few seconds, Emily heard only the wind howling through the cracks and the held-in breaths of the patients, as if everyone had realized at once that the last trace of normalcy had gone out. She pulled the flashlight from her lab coat pocket and clicked it on, casting a wavering yellow beam that danced across the walls. She walked to the control panel, checked the fuses, tried to restart the system, but the board was lifeless. Without power, refrigerators and monitors shut down completely. The temperature of critical medications would begin to rise within minutes, threatening insulin, antibiotics and anesthetics they might need. She took a deep breath, called over the 2 volunteers who had chosen to stay, and assigned tasks. One would check the security of the interior doors, while the other fetched thermal boxes from the supply room. In the inner corridor where the patients were gathered, Emily opened one of the ice boxes brought from the kitchen and began transferring insulin vials and other sensitive ampules inside. She packed them with ice plates, sealed them tightly, and marked the date and time with tape for control. Every move followed the emergency protocols she'd learned, carried out with calm and precision. The baby slept, oblivious to the chaos, as the mother rocked him under a blanket. The elderly dialysis patient trembled more from fear than cold, and Emily knelt beside him to take his blood pressure and offer water. Meanwhile, the rain hammered the walls so hard it sounded like a drum. The noise was unbroken, and each gust made the entire building shudder. She kept glancing upward to check for cracks in the ceiling, memorizing alternative exits in case she had to move everyone again. Around 3 a.m., a new sound cut through the roar of the wind, running water. Emily followed it to the stairwell leading down to the lower floor. A thin sheet of water was trickling down the steps. She went down a few stairs and saw muddy water creeping across the service entrance floor. She hurried back to the central room, gathered the 2 volunteers, and told them they'd have to move the patients upstairs where it was still dry. With no elevator, they made a slow climb up the emergency stairwell, lit only by flashlights. Patient by patient, they went carefully. First the teen with the cast, then the elderly man in his wheelchair with the guard's help, and finally the mother and her baby. Emily carried IV bags and medicines close to her body, keeping everything within reach. The physical effort was intense. The heat and humidity made every breath heavy, but she kept her voice calm so as not to pass on her fatigue. In the new space, a corridor of disused consultation rooms, they quickly lined up the stretchers. Emily cracked open interior windows for air circulation and placed flashlights in strategic spots. She herself felt her body trembling from hunger and exhaustion, but forced herself to sip water so she wouldn't faint. She looked at each patient and repeated their priorities in her head. Check vital signs, control medication temperatures, soothe anyone crying, maintain eye contact so they knew they were being cared for. At moments, she leaned a hand against the wall to catch her breath, but went straight back to work. Tired, scared, and hungry, she still found motivation in the eyes of those depending on her. The sense of isolation felt almost physical, like weight on her shoulders, but she fought it with action. Just as she thought she'd gained a reprieve, a loud crack split the air. Part of a consultation room ceiling collapsed under the force of the wind, scattering plaster and wood across the floor. Emily shouted a warning, ran over, and saw one of the flashlights had fallen. She ordered the volunteers to immediately move the patients from that area into the most central corridor. She held the elderly man's wheelchair while the guard helped the mother with the baby. The sound of the wind was now joined by heavy drips falling from the hole in the ceiling. Her heart was racing, but her movements were precise. She checked that no one was hurt, made a quick head count, calmed the crying teenager, and reorganized everyone in the safe space. She pushed cabinets against the door to block any debris carried in by the air. In the tense quiet that followed, she took a deep breath and looked up, judging whether more collapse might come. With things seemingly stable again, Emily picked up the radio she had loaded with fresh batteries and tried to make contact once more. She turned the dial, waited through static, repeated her call until at last, a faint voice answered. Amid crackles, the National Guard asked for her location and the condition of the patients. She responded quickly, telling them they were on the upper floor with medications, but no power and surrounded by floodwaters. On the other end came the promise of rescue only in the morning. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the news. The night would be long with no guarantee of immediate help. She tucked the radio into her pocket and went back to checking on the patients, drawing a deep breath to stay calm. There was no choice but to keep going. She adjusted the flashlight, flexed her fingers to steady the tremor, and kept tending to each of them, as if she were on a regular shift, even as the world outside was coming apart under the hurricane. Emily had already set up the makeshift ward on the upper floor and now had to keep that small group together. With every minute of silence from the radio, the tension grew. With her flashlight clipped to her pocket, she walked the corridor, calling the volunteers by name and checking that everyone was at their post. She asked the security guard to keep an eye on the interior doors and report any leaks, while directing the older volunteer to jot down vital signs and small incidents in a makeshift notebook. She divided the patients by priority: the most fragile, close to the inner wall, the stable ones seated farther back, and those able to help were given small tasks like handing out blankets and water. She spoke slowly, repeating instructions so everyone could follow. This organization created a sense of control that calmed whispers and worried looks. The wind's noise was constant, but the space began to take on a rhythm, each of her gestures acting as a point of reference for the others. At the corner where the intubated patients lay, Emily organized a rotation for the volunteers to operate the manual ventilators. She demonstrated the correct movement, showed the timing between compressions, and corrected nervous hands with patience. Her tone wasn't hurried, only steady. She stayed nearby to ensure the rhythm held, checking pulses with her fingers, while glancing at the darkened monitors. Between instructions, she moved among the other patients, placing water bottles within reach, draping blankets over shoulders, and answering questions. The effort was both physical and mental, but the steady rhythm gave the volunteers confidence to continue. The teenage girl with the cast, who had been crying at first, began holding flashlights for Emily as she worked, a sign that trust was slowly returning. Just when everything seemed under control, an 8-year-old boy with his grandmother began breathing fast and shallow. His crying turned to whimpering and his eyes widened in fear. Emily rushed to him immediately, asked the grandmother to hold his hand, and cleared space around them. With the flashlight clenched between her teeth, she checked his airway, propped his torso on makeshift pillows, and used a small handheld device she'd found among the supplies to assist his breathing. She kept her voice calm, explaining what she was doing so the grandmother could cooperate to keep him steady. Within minutes, his breathing became more regular, though still tearful. Emily took the chance to instruct the grandmother to give him small sips of water and keep him sitting upright to avoid another episode. The scene left the room in a hush, everyone realizing the nurse was watching every detail. On the other side, the young mother began showing signs of severe anxiety. She trembled, breathing in quick bursts, her eyes fixed on the door as if expecting something to crash through. The baby's crying only heightened the tension. Emily approached carefully, asked permission, and took the baby into her arms, rocking him slowly. She walked the corridor with the child, speaking soft phrases while signaling one of the calmer volunteers to sit beside the mother. She told him to hold the woman's hand, speak reassuring words, and breathe with her, creating a steady anchor for her to calm down. Seeing her baby safe and feeling someone at her side, the mother's shoulders slowly relaxed and she managed to sit, sipping some water. Emily returned the now calmer baby, maintaining eye contact and offering a faint smile to pass on confidence. Emily reorganized the boxes of bottled water they'd brought from the supply room and instructed everyone to drink in small sips to make sure the stock would last until rescue. She paired each volunteer with a specific patient, creating small support teams. A teenager now held flashlights for her while she examined the elderly man. An older woman handed out clean cloths to the children. The security guard kept the corridor clear for movement. People who had been terrified only hours before were now asking what more they could do. Despite her exhaustion, Emily moved among them with a firm but calm presence, checking every detail, listening to doubts, and answering with patience. The ward no longer felt like a crowd trapped by the storm, but a small community with purpose. When she finally looked at the clock, she saw dawn was still far off. The radio hissed only static, and there was no word from outside. Even so, the makeshift ward was under control. Manual ventilators running smoothly, children calmer, adults cooperating. Emily sat for a moment on the bench against the wall, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just a shift anymore. It was a shelter in the middle of a disaster. And while the hurricane raged outside, she realized that at least for that night, she had managed to turn fear into action and give this group a sense of safety they would not have had without her. The first different sound of that dawn was a low hum slicing through the air, no longer the roar of the wind or the cracking of walls, but the churn of approaching rotor blades. Emily lifted her head from the chart where she'd been jotting down vital signs, and through the skylight in the corridor saw blinking lights crossing the grey sky. The National Guard had arrived. A ripple ran through the makeshift ward. The teenager sat up, the elderly man raised his head. The mother clutched her baby. Emily raised her hands, asked for calm, and explained that rescue had come, but everyone would need to follow her directions to leave safely. The lower floor was partially flooded, so evacuation would be through the roof, using the emergency stairwell. She asked the volunteers to line up the patients by priority, check blankets and documents, and keep the medication boxes close. Even exhausted, her voice projected steadiness and order. The pale light of dawn filtered through the cracks, revealing faces tired but full of hope. Minutes later, soldiers came down a side access, carrying folding stretchers and ropes. Emily went to meet them, giving short, direct descriptions of each patient's condition. She asked that the most critical be taken first, staying alongside to secure straps and IV bags and holding the manual respirator herself as they climbed the metal stairs. The rotor wash whipped up spray and dust, making it hard to see, but she kept her steps sure. With each patient transferred, she glanced back to be sure the volunteers were also bringing lanterns, blankets, and thermal boxes. In the corridor, she gave clear instructions for those waiting their turn to stay seated, breathing deeply, avoiding crowding. The teenager with the cast helped soothe an older woman while waiting, proof that Emily's system was working. When it was the young mother's turn, her legs gave out. She shook so badly she couldn't climb the first step. The baby cried, and the helicopter noise heightened the panic. Emily stepped forward without hesitation, took the baby gently in her arms, rocking him slowly. With her free hand, she guided the mother to the base of the stairs, speaking softly to help her breathe. A soldier positioned himself at her side to steady her while Emily climbed first with the child, shielding him from the wind. At the top, she handed the baby safely to the helicopter paramedic and immediately went back down to help others. The human chain formed by volunteers passed up bags, papers, and flashlights with methodical care so nothing would be lost in the narrow, wet passage. Amid this intense rhythm, Emily's body began to show signs of exhaustion. As she held the elderly man's wheelchair to help him up, a sudden wave of dizziness darkened her vision for an instant. She gripped the metal railing, drew a deep breath, and closed her eyes, but didn't let anyone see the lapse. A soldier reached out a hand, but she shook her head and asked for just a moment. Straightening up, she pulled the man back into motion and kept climbing. Each step felt heavier than the last, but her determination didn't falter. There was no time to think about her own limits while lives depended on her. At the top, she helped place the man on a stretcher and made sure he got some water before boarding. On the roof, soldiers' service cameras were recording every stage of the rescue. Emily didn't know it, but her image, carrying children, steadying the elderly, issuing clear instructions, was being captured and transmitted back to the operations center. The cutting wind whipped her hair from its bun and plastered her coat to her sweaty back. She directed patients and volunteers to lie down for safe loading, while helicopters rose and descended without pause. When she finally saw everyone aboard, she walked the rooftop, checking every corner to be sure no one was left. The sweep was almost automatic, a reflex from a night spent counting heads and safeguarding lives. At each glance, she offered a final word of encouragement, even though her voice was hoarse. When she was sure everyone was inside, the soldiers signaled for her to board the helicopter. Emily took a deep breath, cast one last look at the flooded building below, and only then let them help her climb aboard. She was the last to leave the hospital. Sitting on the metal bench of the helicopter, gripping the rail to steady herself, she heard the relieved crying of the mother with her baby. The teenager asleep on the volunteer's shoulder. the elderly man pressing his hands together in gratitude. Below, the building where she had spent the longest hours of her career disappeared beneath the low clouds. She closed her eyes, not to sleep but to breathe, knowing that even without direct witnesses that night had changed everyone there, including herself. The days following the rescue were marked by a different kind of silence, not the roar of the hurricane anymore, but a collective exhaustion hanging over the devastated streets. Emily, temporarily housed in a gym converted into a shelter for health professionals, woke up early to help with makeshift medical stations while waiting for official news about the hospital. The building where she had spent the longest night of her life was irreparably destroyed. Outer walls collapsed, sections of the roof ripped away, equipment submerged in muddy water. The city was beginning a reconstruction process that seemed impossible at first glance. Downed power poles, cars piled up, homes without roofs. Yet as she walked through the streets, Emily also saw neighbors clearing debris together, handing out food and improvising support centers. That community energy fueled the same calm she had relied on during the disaster. Though exhausted, she helped organize lists of missing persons and reunite rescued patients with their families, maintaining the quiet professionalism that defined her. Meanwhile, footage recorded by soldiers and news crews began circulating, first on local newscasts, then on national networks. The image of the nurse in a soaked coat carrying a baby and guiding elderly patients up a metal stairwell against fierce winds became a symbol of resilience. Newspapers ran headlines like "She stayed" and "Courage in the eye of the storm." On social media, short clips showed her focused expression as she spoke to volunteers, her steady hands gripping stretchers, her calm as she supported the baby's mother. Comments poured in from across the country, strangers saying they felt inspired, healthcare workers writing that she embodied the best of their profession. Emily watched all this in disbelief, sitting on a bench at the shelter, trying to understand how one night of work had become national news. Days later, she received an official invitation to appear before the state senate to speak about disaster preparedness. She had never imagined herself in front of microphones and cameras, but accepted because she knew she could offer practical recommendations on evacuation, medication stockpiles, and volunteer training. During the hearing, her soft Louisiana accent carried through as she spoke plainly about what she had experienced: the blackout, the loss of communication, the collective effort to keep patients alive. She didn't give heroic speeches or dramatic sound bites. She answered questions, described failures, and suggested improvements. Lawmakers and reporters took notes on every word. When she left, spontaneous applause echoed in the hallway, but she walked to the official car with the same calm stride she used after a night shift. To her, none of this changed who she was or what she felt she needed to do. In the days that followed came awards and recognition. Medical associations sent certificates of courage, community organizations donated funds to rebuild the hospital, and a university offered her a full scholarship for a public health management program. Emily accepted with gratitude, but kept saying she had only done her job. She wasn't seeking the spotlight, but welcomed the honors as a way to highlight the teams who had stayed as well. In interviews, she spoke of the volunteers, the security guard, the woman handing out clean cloths, the teenager holding flashlights. She stressed that no one survives a disaster alone, and that every small action adds up. That attitude only deepened the public's admiration, showing that this wasn't just an emotional story, but a real example of professional ethics and empathy. A few weeks later, the community organized a simple ceremony in a rebuilt square. Patients she had saved brought flowers. Relatives of others hugged her with tears in their eyes. Volunteers presented her with a framed collage of photos taken during the rescue. The baby she had carried into the helicopter was there, sleeping peacefully in his smiling mother's arms. The elderly man from dialysis walked with a new cane, thanking her softly. Emily stepped onto a small makeshift stage to receive a plaque of recognition, but asked to speak briefly. She thanked everyone and urged them to keep helping one another, because rebuilding would be neither quick nor easy. She spoke with the same clarity she had used during her night shift, reminding them that anyone can act when everything seems lost. When she finished her speech, she looked out at the crowd gathered in the square. Neighbors, journalists, volunteers, patients. She saw signs of support and heard applause that seemed to wash away the accumulated fatigue. For a moment, she drew a deep breath and allowed herself to smile. There were no helicopters or icy winds now, only human faces looking back at her with gratitude. The story of that night in the hospital no longer belonged to her. It had become something larger, and as the sun set behind the scaffolding of the half-rebuilt houses, Emily felt that one act of individual courage could indeed inspire collective change, weaving a thread of hope that connected strangers around a common purpose. The end. So what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.